Lights didn't dim the way people expected. They didn't fade gently into reverence or applause. They stalled, just long enough for discomfort to creep in. And in that half second of silence, a question began spreading across the room like a low electrical hum. Did that really just happen? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because this was supposed to be a coronation moment, a carefully staged return, a soft focus redemption arc played out on one of the most respected cultural stages in the world. Instead, it felt like a public ambush. Sundance. January 2026. A packed theater in Utah filled with filmmakers, critics, legacy families, streaming executives, and insiders who rarely forget and almost never forgive. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle sat front and center, framed by camera flashes and whispered anticipation, there to celebrate the premiere of their documentary Cookie Queens. The mood was meant to be celebratory, controlled, earnest, but then the microphone passed, and everything shifted. What happens when Hollywood royalty turns on real royalty live on stage with no script, no edit, and no escape? That's the moment we're unpacking today. Not just the words spoken, but the tension underneath them. Not just the laughter, but the silence that followed. And not just the joke, but why it landed so hard that people in the room are still talking about it weeks later. Because this wasn't just a roast. It was a signal. And whether you admire Meghan Markle, defend her, criticize her, or feel exhausted by the entire saga, one thing is undeniable. Something cracked that night. Something public. Something irreversible. And the most unsettling part? This didn't come from tabloids. It didn't come from palace leaks. It didn't even come from social media. It came from the stage, at Sundance, from someone the room trusted. Let's rewind. Sundance has always been different. It isn't Cannes dripping in luxury and global spectacle. It isn't the Oscars, polished and predictable. Sundance is intimate. It's uncomfortable by design. The rooms are smaller. The crowds are sharper. The applause is earned, not assumed. People don't come here to be worshipped. They come here to be tested. And that's exactly why Prince Harry and Meghan Markle chose this festival for their documentary debut. After years of mixed press, polarizing interviews, and an ever-tightening narrative around brand Sussex, Sundance offered something rare: legitimacy without excess. No red carpets stretching for blocks. No royal pomp. Just art, storytelling, and credibility. At least that was the plan. Cookie Queens was positioned as personal, intimate, almost disarmingly sincere. A story about reinvention, about purpose, about finding meaning outside the institutions that once defined you. The messaging was deliberate, grounded, human. The irony? Sundance audiences are allergic to branding disguised as vulnerability. They can smell it. Still, the room that night leaned in. There was polite applause, curious faces, phones discreetly lowered, not raised. This wasn't a hostile crowd. It was a cautious one, observant, reserved, waiting to be convinced. And then Amy Redford stepped forward. Now, pause here, because context matters. At Sundance, names carry weight. Not influencer weight, not celebrity weight, legacy weight, history, cultural memory. And when someone from one Sundance's founding families takes the stage, the room shifts. Not loudly, subtly, like people sitting up straighter without realizing it. Amy Redford wasn't there to provoke headlines. She wasn't there to chase virality. She wasn't even framed as a comedian or provocateur. She was introduced as part of the festival's living lineage, someone who belonged. That's why what came next landed the way it did. The line itself, which we'll dissect later, wasn't screamed, it wasn't theatrical, it was delivered casually, almost offhand, as if it were already understood, and that's what made it dangerous. Laughter rippled through parts of the room. Not explosive laughter. Not everyone. The kind that escapes before people can stop themselves. The kind that carries recognition. Others froze. Some looked toward Meghan. Some looked down. Some looked anywhere but the stage. And Prince Harry? He didn't laugh. That detail will matter later. In that moment, Meghan Markle was still smiling. The practiced smile. The public smile. The one that has carried her through hostile interviews and glowing praise alike. But something flickered behind it. A microsecond of recalculation, of disbelief. Because this wasn't supposed to happen here. Sundance was meant to be neutral ground, a safe harbor, a place where the Sussexes could exist not as tabloid fixtures or royal renegades, but as storytellers, creators, participants in the cultural conversation, not the punchline. But suddenly, they were the reference point, and not in the way they intended. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Jokes don't land in a vacuum. They only work when the audience already holds the context, when the laughter isn't about surprise, but recognition. And the phrase that echoed through that room carried years of whispers, online commentary, cruel nicknames, and half-buried accusations that had never fully disappeared. The difference was this: they had never been spoken there. Not on that stage, not by that voice. That's what made the moment feel like a rupture. For years, critics accused Meghan of chasing fame. Supporters countered that she was unfairly maligned, targeted, reduced. The truth, depending on who you ask, lived somewhere in between or nowhere at all. But Sundance doesn't traffic in absolutes. It traffics in subtext. And the subtext that night was brutal. This wasn't a journalist asking a pointed question. This wasn't a social media troll hiding behind anonymity. This was the industry laughing quietly, as if to say, we see you, and we're no longer pretending. If you're wondering why this moment exploded beyond the room, here's why. For the first time, Meghan Markle wasn't being challenged by the institutions she rejected, or the press she criticized. She was being challenged by the culture she wanted to join. That hits differently, because Hollywood has rules, even when it claims not to. One of them is this: you can reinvent yourself, but you can't dictate how others see you. You can tell your story, but you can't force the audience's reaction. And on that night, the reaction slipped. What followed wasn't immediate outrage. There were no boos, no walkouts, no confrontation on stage. That's not Sundance's style. The punishment there is quieter. It's the conversations afterward, the looks exchanged, the recalibration, because everyone in that room knew something had shifted. They felt it, and Meghan likely did too. The documentary screening continued. The applause came, politely. The photos were taken, the official narrative moved forward. But beneath it all, a question lingered, unspoken but heavy. If this can happen here, where else might it happen? And that's the question that turns a single line into a larger story. Because the roast wasn't the climax, it was the opening crack. What no one realized in that moment, as the laughter faded and the light shifted, was that this wasn't spontaneous, it wasn't careless, and it wasn't isolated. There was a reason that line existed, a reason it felt rehearsed without being scripted, a reason it echoed long after the applause stopped. And as we'll see next, the choice of Sundance as the stage wasn't just ironic. Why Sundance? That's the question people in the room kept asking themselves after the laughter faded and the air turned heavy. Not out loud, not to each other, but internally. Because once the illusion cracked, everything that came before it demanded re-examination. Why here? Why now? Why the stage? Because Sundance isn't just a film festival, it's a test. And Prince Harry and Meghan Markle walked straight into it believing they were in control. Here's the contradiction that matters. Sundance sells itself as anti-Hollywood, anti-glamour, anti-manufactured narratives. It was built as a refuge for filmmakers who didn't want studio notes, image consultants, or corporate polish. Even now, decades later, the mythology holds. This is where authenticity wins. This is where art outranks branding. This is where power doesn't protect you. And yet, that's exactly why the Sussexes came. On paper, it was a brilliant move. No red carpets dripping in excess, no royal pomp, no palace shadows, just a snow-covered town in Utah, indie filmmakers, earnest conversations, and an audience that prides itself on seeing through artifice. If there was any place Meghan Markle could reposition herself not as a duchess, not as a tabloid figure, but as a creator, this was it. Or so they thought. Because Sundance has an unspoken rule no one tells you until it's too late. It doesn't reward reinvention. It interrogates it. And reinvention was the entire point of this appearance. Let's rewind further. By 22/6, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle weren't new stories anymore. They were familiar ones, overexposed, some would say. Their interviews had been dissected, their silences interpreted, their projects categorized before release. The cultural fatigue wasn't universal, but it was real. So when Cookie Queens was announced, the language around it was telling. personal, intimate, unfiltered, a departure. Those words appeared again and again in press materials, in whispered expectations, in the way their team framed the project to industry insiders. This wasn't a royal grievance piece. This was an immediate takedown. This was something softer, something warmer, something human. And Sundance audiences want to believe in that kind of pivot, but they don't take it at face value. Here's where the illusion begins to form. When you arrive at Sundance, you don't arrive as a celebrity. You arrive as a filmmaker. At least, that's the expectation. You stand in line. You sit in cramped theaters. You answer uncomfortable questions. You earn the room. Harry and Meghan didn't stand in line. They arrived surrounded by handlers, security, and quiet deference. Not excessive, but noticeable. Enough to create a subtle separation. Enough to remind everyone present that this wasn't just another debut. This was a managed moment. Did that doom them from the start? Maybe not. But it planted a seed, because Sundance audiences are hyper-aware of hierarchy. They claim to reject it, but they recognize it instantly. And when someone insists they're just like everyone else, while being treated differently, the tension begins. Still, there was goodwill, curiosity, even optimism. People wanted this to work. That's the part that often gets lost. Despite the jokes, despite the skepticism, despite the whispered eye rolls, there was genuine interest in seeing what the Sussexes would bring to a space that values vulnerability over spectacle. The room wasn't hostile, it was cautious. And caution at Sundance is an invitation. Then came the introductions, the formalities, the framing of the evening as a celebration not of fame, but of storytelling. The festival did its part. It created the conditions for sincerity, which makes what followed all the more jarring. Because when Amy Redford stepped up, she wasn't there to challenge power. She was there to welcome participants into a tradition. Her presence symbolized continuity, respect, a kind of cultural stewardship. That's why the joke cut the way it did. But before we get there, we need to understand something critical. Harry and Meghan didn't just choose Sundance. Sundance chose to let them in. That matters. This wasn't a desperate grab for legitimacy. It was a calculated alignment. Sundance had, in recent years, opened its doors wider to high-profile figures exploring documentary work. The line between celebrity and creator had blurred, carefully, strategically, so the Sussexes fit, on paper. But Sundance also has a memory. It remembers when authenticity is earned and when it's borrowed. And borrowed authenticity is the one thing this festival punishes without mercy. Here's the quiet irony no one likes to say out loud. For years, Meghan Markle criticized institutions for being rigid, hierarchical, and unwelcoming. Sundance, by contrast, prides itself on openness, on merit, on dismantling old power structures. So why did it feel, to some in the room, like the Sussexes were trying to import their own hierarchy into a space that resisted? That's the tension that hummed beneath the surface long before the roast, because reinvention requires humility. And humility is difficult when your life has been lived under global scrutiny. When Meghan smiled that night, she wasn't faking warmth. She was performing resilience, a skill she has mastered, a shield she has relied on. But Sundance isn't impressed by shields. It wants cracks. And that's what the joke exposed. Think about it. If the same line had been delivered at an award show, it might have passed unnoticed, lost in the noise, written off as tasteless humor. But at Sundance, every word echoes. Why? Because the rooms are small. Because the people listening are powerful. Because the silence afterward matters more than the laugh. And the silence that followed that line wasn't accidental. It was assessment. People were recalculating in real time, reframing what they thought they knew, rewatching moments in their heads, reevaluating Cookie Queens before it even finished screening. That's the danger of Sundance. Your work doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in conversation with who you are, how you arrived, and how you're perceived when the lights are off. So ask yourself this. If Harry and Meghan had debuted this documentary anywhere else, would this moment have mattered? Probably not. But here, it became symbolic. Because Sundance isn't about what you say you are. It's about what the room decides you represent. And in that moment, the room decided something uncomfortable. Not unanimously, not maliciously, but perceptibly. The Sussexes weren't being judged as victims or villains. They were being judged as participants in an industry that values self-awareness above all else. And that's where the illusion began to crumble, because reinvention to work requires consent. You can't declare it, the audience has to grant it. And that night, consent wavered. Here's the twist most people missed. The roast wasn't the first sign of resistance. It was the first public one. There had been murmurs earlier in the day, private comments, questions framed politely but edged with skepticism, observations about tone, about framing, about intent. Nothing explosive, just enough to suggest that the ground wasn't as solid as it appeared. So when Amy Redford spoke, she didn't create a rupture. She revealed one. And that's why the moment felt rehearsed without being scripted. It aligned too neatly with the unspoken mood of the room, which raises a far more unsettling question. What if the joke wasn't about Meghan at all? What if it was about Sundance drawing a line, a way of saying, we'll host you, but we won't protect you? That's a sobering realization for anyone accustomed to controlled narratives. Because once you lose protection, you're exposed. And exposure in Hollywood is rarely kind. As the evening progressed, something else became clear. The Sussexes weren't just guests, they were case studies. Everyone watching was asking themselves the same question. Can someone who has lived inside one of the most rigid hierarchies in the world truly adapt to a space that despises hierarchy? Or will the performance always show? That's the contradiction Sundance thrives on. It welcomes you in, then watches closely to see if you belong. And belonging isn't granted by title, sympathy, or even talent. It's granted by alignment. That night, alignment faltered. The documentary itself, when it screened, was received politely. Some praised its intimacy, others questioned its framing. But the conversation had already shifted. The film was no longer the sole focus. The moment had reframed everything. And here's the part that makes this story more than gossip. Harry and Meghan didn't miscalculate by coming to Sundance. They miscalculated by assuming Sundance would treat them like anywhere else. But Sundance never does. It challenges power by pretending not to see it, then acknowledging it all at once, which is exactly what happened. As the audience filed out into the cold Utah night, conversations buzzed. Not loud, not dramatic, measured, analytical. The kind that carries weight in the days and weeks that follow. Because Sundance doesn't erupt in the moment. It decides quietly, and then the industry follows. And somewhere in that quiet recalibration, a question took root that would soon spread far beyond that theater. If this is how the room responds now, what happens next? Because the illusion wasn't just cracked, it was being examined. And once that happens, nothing stays contained for long. She didn't have to say her last name. That's the part most people outside the room missed. When Amy stepped onto that stage, there was no long introduction explaining who she was or why she mattered. No resume rundown. No applause line built around her lineage. None of that was necessary. At Sundance, recognition happens before acknowledgement. People knew. And that's exactly why the room leaned forward. Because when someone from a founding family speaks at Sundance, it doesn't feel like commentary. It feels like an internal conversation being made public. Not an outsider throwing stones. An insider clearing her throat. So before we even get to the line itself, we have to ask the uncomfortable question most headlines skipped entirely. Why did her voice carry so much weight? Why didn't people dismiss it as tasteless humor or a bad joke? And why did no one rush to shut it down? The answer lives in the quiet power structure Sundance pretends don't exist. Sundance was built on rebellion, yes, on independence, on pushing back against Hollywood excess. But like every cultural institution that survives long enough, it developed its own hierarchy, a softer one, less obvious, but just as real. Founding families don't dominate the room, they don't bark orders, they don't need to. Their authority is ambient. It exists in the air, in who gets invited back, in whose mistakes are forgiven, in whose words land as truth rather than provocation. Amy Redford grew up inside that atmosphere, not as a celebrity child chasing relevance, but as someone who watched power operate quietly. She saw how Sundance rewarded sincerity and punished performance long before social media made those terms fashionable. She understood the unspoken rules, not because she read them somewhere, but because she lived them. which means when she stepped on stage, she wasn't testing the room, she was reading it. And what she read that night wasn't admiration. It wasn't hostility either. It was something far more dangerous for someone trying to rebrand. It was skepticism disguised as politeness. That's the kind of skepticism that doesn't argue. It waits. Here's where the contrast sharpens. Prince Harry and Meghan Markle arrived at Sundance with global recognition, but limited insider capital. Fame? Yes. Sympathy, depending on who you ask. Curiosity, certainly. But insider trust? That takes time. And time is something reinvention narratives rarely allow. Amy, on the other hand, didn't need to prove anything. She didn't need to posture. She wasn't selling a project. She wasn't defending a brand. She was participating in a ritual she'd seen play out dozens of times before. And rituals matter at Sundance. There's an unspoken expectation that anyone who steps on that stage understands the balance between self-awareness and self-importance. It's not about humility in the performative sense. It's about knowing where you stand in relation to the room. That's why the joke landed the way it did, because it didn't feel like an attack upward or downward. It felt lateral, peer-to-peer, a reminder that no one on that stage is above commentary. Except, of course, Meghan wasn't perceived as a peer. That's the fracture. For years, Meghan Markle has occupied a strange cultural position. Too famous for indie credibility, too polarizing for casual indifference, too controlled for genuine unpredictability. She exists in a liminal space that frustrates audiences who want to categorize her. Hero, villain, victim, manipulator. Pick one. Sundance audiences hate binaries. They want complexity, contradiction, messiness. And when someone arrives with a narrative that feels prepackaged, they don't attack it directly. They wait for it to unravel. Amy's line wasn't the unraveling. It was the tug. Now, consider this. If a comedian had made the same remark, it would have been written off as shock humor. If a journalist had asked a pointed question, it would have been framed as antagonism. If a social media user had said it, it would have been ignored or weaponized depending on allegiance. But when someone like Amy says it, the room doesn't laugh because it's funny. It laughs because it recognizes the subtext. That's a crucial difference. And that subtext wasn't just about Meghan. It was about the disconnect between how Meghan sees herself and how the industry increasingly sees her. Hollywood loves reinvention stories, but it loves them most when they come from people who acknowledge their own artifice, who wink at the audience, who admit the performance even as they perform. Meghan doesn't do that. She insists on sincerity, on moral clarity, on her version of events as definitive. That rigidity plays well in advocacy spaces. It struggles in creative ones. Sundance isn't interested in who you say you are. It's interested in who you reveal yourself to be when you stop controlling the narrative. And that's where Amy's role becomes even more interesting. She didn't punch down. She didn't rant. She didn't escalate. She dropped a single phrase and let the room do the rest. That's a veteran move, because the power wasn't in the words. It was in the pause afterward. People forget this, but silence is the most dangerous response at Sundance. Applause can be polite, laughter can be reflexive, silence means evaluation. And there was silence. Not total, not dramatic, but selective. Enough to signal that something had shifted. Amy didn't need to push further. She had already drawn the line. And here's the part that complicates the narrative. There's no evidence she did this out of personal animosity. No leaked feud, no prior public criticism, no obvious motive tied to personal history, which makes the moment harder to dismiss. Because if this wasn't personal, then what was it? Institutional. That's the word no one wants to use. Institutional discomfort with a figure who challenges systems while simultaneously leveraging them, with someone who critiques hierarchy while benefiting from it, with someone who claims authenticity while operating through meticulous control. Sundance doesn't like that contradiction. It tolerates ambition. It tolerates ego. It even tolerates hypocrisy to a degree. What it doesn't tolerate is denial, and Meghan's public persona leaves little room for self-critique. Amy's joke wasn't cruel because it wasn't detailed. It didn't accuse, it didn't explain. It simply referenced a cultural shorthand that already existed and trusted the audience to fill in the blanks. That's a risky move unless you're confident the audience will follow. She was confident, and the audience did. Which brings us to Prince Harry. Because while Meghan absorbed the moment visibly, Harry absorbed it quietly. And that quiet mattered. Harry has always occupied a different emotional register. He's more reactive, more expressive, more visibly affected by public sentiment. When he laughs, it's obvious. When he's uncomfortable, it shows. That night, he didn't laugh. Not because he didn't understand the joke, not because he was offended, but because he recognized what it signaled. Harry knows rooms. He grew up in them. He understands when an institution is withdrawing its benefit of the doubt. And that's exactly what was happening. Amy's presence made that withdrawal unmistakable. This wasn't the press misinterpreting a moment. This wasn't social media amplifying a misstep. This was the culture itself drawing a boundary. And once boundaries are drawn, they don't easily disappear. The most unsettling part? No one rushed to Meghan's defense. Not publicly, not in the room, not afterward. There were statements later, carefully worded, vague, focused on positivity and art, and moving forward. But no apology from Amy, no backlash from Sundance, no distancing. That silence was intentional. Because in Sundance culture, apologies are reserved for genuine transgressions. And this wasn't framed as one, it was framed as commentary. And commentary in that space is protected, which leads to the uncomfortable realization that makes this story bigger than a single night. Amy Redford didn't roast Meghan Markle. Sundance did. Through her. And once an institution like that signals discomfort, the ripple effects are slow but deep. Projects get reassessed, invitations change tone, conversations shift behind closed doors. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. Just enough to alter trajectories, and that's what makes this moment so dangerous for someone whose brand relies on careful positioning. Because Meghan didn't lose control in that moment. She lost consensus. And consensus is everything in Hollywood. As the night moved on and the festival continued, the Sussexes were still welcomed, still photographed, still present. But something had changed. They were no longer being evaluated as potential insiders. They were being observed as outsiders trying to enter. And Sundance, quietly, was deciding whether it wanted to open that door any further. But the real consequences wouldn't be visible immediately. They would surface later in how the documentary was discussed, in how future projects were pitched, in how invitations were extended or quietly withheld. And that brings us to the moment everyone noticed but few understood. The phrase itself, the one that echoed beyond the room, the one that resurfaced whispers long thought buried, the one that reframed the entire narrative in a single breath. Because now that the line had been crossed, people felt licensed to say things they had previously kept to themselves. And once that happens, the story no longer belongs to the person at its center. It belongs to the crowd. And what the crowd did next would surprise everyone. It wasn't loud. That's the detail that keeps getting lost. The moment didn't explode. It didn't derail the event. There was no gasp that rippled across the room like a wave. No sharp intake of breath caught on camera. No audible collective shock. Instead, it arrived quietly. A sentence, a pause, a reaction that split the room down the middle. And that's why it worked. Because if you wanted to design the most destabilizing moment possible at Sundance, this is exactly how you'd do it. Not with outrage, not with confrontation, but with something subtle enough to pass as humor and sharp enough to leave a mark. The line itself was delivered casually, almost conversational, as if it were a shared reference, not a provocation. Amy didn't lean into it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't telegraph that something controversial was coming. That's important, because the danger of a joke isn't in how loudly it's told. It's in how confidently it assumes agreement. And that line, assumed agreement, the room responded in fragments. A few laughs here, a few murmurs there, a handful of people stiffening, unsure whether to react at all. The kind of response that tells you everyone heard it, but not everyone knew how to process it in real time. This wasn't laughter for the sake of laughter. It was recognition, the kind that slips out before you can stop it. Now watch Meghan. This is where body language tells a more honest story than any statement released later. At first, she smiled, instinctively, automatically, the public-facing smile she has perfected over years of scrutiny. It appeared on cue, as if summoned by muscle memory alone. But then it lingered a beat too long. And that's where something shifted. Because a genuine smile fades naturally. A practiced one hesitates. It waits for confirmation that the moment has passed safely. That confirmation never came. Her eyes moved quickly. Not dramatically, just enough to scan the room. To assess. To recalibrate. It was the look of someone realizing that the rules they thought governed the room might— The phrase Amy used wasn't new. It wasn't invented on the spot. It had circulated online for years, whispered in comment sections, repeated in fringe spaces, dismissed by supporters as misogynistic or cruel. What made it different that night was the setting. This wasn't a comment section. This wasn't a tabloid headline. This was Sundance. By saying it there, Amy didn't legitimize the phrase itself. She acknowledged its existence. And in doing so, she acknowledged the unresolved tension surrounding Meghan's public image. That's what the audience reacted to. Not the insult, the implication. Because the implication was this: you can't outrun a narrative simply by changing venues. If anything, Sundance sharpens it. And that realization landed in real time. You could feel it in the way the room's energy subtly shifted afterward. The applause that followed felt polite, measured, the kind that checks a box rather than expresses enthusiasm. The evening continued. It had to. But something had been introduced into the space that couldn't be ignored. The documentary screening that followed was suddenly burdened with context it didn't ask for. Scenes that might have been received neutrally now carried extra weight. Lines that spoke of resilience or reinvention invited comparison. Was this vulnerability? Or was it performance? Sundance audiences asked that question reflexively. And now they were asking it about Meghan. That's the danger of an ill-timed moment in a space that values subtext. Because Sundance doesn't respond immediately. It absorbs, it analyzes, it replays. People left the theater talking quietly, not about the film's cinematography, not about its themes, but about that moment. Not even the words themselves, the reaction to them. Who laughed, who didn't, who looked uncomfortable, who seemed unfazed. These are the things insiders clock and insiders talk. Now, let's address the uncomfortable accusation that surfaced almost immediately afterward. Some claimed the moment was cruel, that it reinforced misogynistic tropes, that it unfairly targeted a woman who has been relentlessly scrutinized. Those critiques aren't baseless. They deserve consideration. But they weren't the dominant reaction in the room. The dominant reaction was unease. Not at the joke, but at what it revealed. Because the room wasn't offended on Meghan's behalf. It was curious about why the line resonated. That distinction matters. If the audience had rejected the comment outright, the moment would have died there. It would have been framed as a misstep, a lapse in judgment, an unfortunate aside. But the lack of rejection gave it oxygen. And oxygen is dangerous for controlled narratives. Harry knew this. You could see it in the way he leaned slightly forward after the moment passed. A physical cue of withdrawal, of inward focus, of recalibration. The kind of posture someone adopts when they realize they're no longer in familiar territory. For years, Harry has spoken about feeling hunted by the press, misunderstood by institutions, alienated by systems he didn't choose. In that room, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't dealing with any of that. He was dealing with cultural judgment. And cultural judgment doesn't come with talking points. Meghan, to her credit, maintained composure. She didn't react outwardly. She didn't confront. She didn't break. That restraint has been both her strength and her vulnerability, because restraint can read as dignity, or it can read as distance. And Sundance audiences are sensitive to that distinction. The moment didn't escalate. No one called it out. No one apologized. No one addressed it directly. Which is precisely why it lingered, because unresolved moments are the ones people remember. By the end of the night, the phrase had already begun its quiet migration beyond the room, not blasted across social media yet, not trending, but passed from mouth to mouth, from insider to insider, framed differently each time. Did you hear what was said? Did you see how they reacted? Did you notice who laughed? This is how narratives form before headlines catch up. And once they form, they're difficult to dismantle. The Sussexes left the venue that night without incident. No confrontation, no public fallout, no dramatic exit, but something had changed. They had arrived as guests being welcomed. They left as subjects being evaluated. That shift is subtle, but it's consequential, because when an audience stops rooting for your success and starts observing your performance, the rules change. You're no longer participating. You're being studied. And that's where the story deepens, because the phrase itself, now unmoored from its original context, began to take on a life of its own. Not as an insult, but as a lens, a shorthand through which people revisited old assumptions, old rumors, old unresolved questions. Things that had been pushed aside in favor of more sympathetic narratives were quietly resurfacing, not because anyone confirmed them, but because the room had signaled that it was acceptable to revisit them. And once that door opens, it doesn't close easily. What happened next didn't occur on stage. It happened backstage, in hallways, in private conversations, in the spaces where reputations are actually shaped. And what unfolded there would prove far more consequential than any line delivered under the lights. Some words don't need explanation. They arrive already loaded, carrying years of context, accusation, defense, denial, and half-remembered arguments. They don't announce themselves as dangerous. They sound almost casual, familiar, dismissible. And that's exactly why they cut deeper than anything shouted in anger ever could. The phrase Amy used didn't shock because it was new. It shocked because it wasn't. People had heard it before, maybe not spoken out loud in rooms like that. Maybe not by someone standing on that stage, but it existed in comment sections, in whispered conversations, in the darker corners of online discourse that polite society pretends not to notice. And yet, everyone in that room knew exactly what it referenced. That's the part that makes this moment so uncomfortable to unpack. Because if the phrase had been meaningless, it would have died instantly. If it had been absurd, it would have drawn confusion. If it had been obviously false, it would have provoked outrage. Instead, it landed with recognition, not agreement. Recognition. There's a difference. Recognition is dangerous because it suggests unresolved tension, something the culture hasn't fully processed. A narrative that's been contested but never conclusively settled. For years, Meghan Markle's public story has existed in fragments. Carefully curated interviews, carefully worded statements, carefully framed grievances. Opposing those were rumors, speculation, insinuations, and outright cruelty. Most institutions chose a side, or chose silence. Sundance did neither. It allowed the reference to exist in the room without endorsing it or condemning it. And that neutrality was devastating, because neutrality in moments like this feels like permission. Now, let's be precise here. The phrase wasn't an accusation. It didn't allege a crime. It didn't present evidence. It didn't even explain itself. It simply gestured toward a cultural shorthand that had been circulating for years. That gesture did the work. Why? Because shorthand only works when the audience fills in the blanks themselves. And the blanks that night were filled instantly. You could feel it in the micro reactions. The subtle nods, the raised eyebrows, the uncomfortable half smiles. The people who didn't laugh but didn't look surprised either. This wasn't a room learning something new. It was a room being reminded of something it had chosen not to say out loud. And that's where the damage lies, because once a reminder enters the space, it reframes everything that follows. Scenes from the documentary that emphasized empowerment suddenly felt defensive. Lines about resilience invited skepticism. Moments meant to humanize instead prompted recalculation. Not because the film changed, because the lens did. Ask yourself this: why did this phrase resurface now, in this space, at this moment? Why not earlier? Why not elsewhere? Because Sundance is where cultural contradictions come to the surface, where the gap between narrative and perception becomes visible. And Meghan's narrative has always been tightly controlled. That control has served her well in hostile environments. It's protected her from tabloid cruelty. It's allowed her to frame her experiences on her own terms. But control becomes a liability in spaces that value vulnerability without choreography. Sundance wants messiness, ambiguity, self-awareness. It wants people to acknowledge how they're perceived, not just how they wish to be seen. And that's where the phrase did its quiet work. It implied a perception Meghan has spent years trying to escape, not because it's fair, not because it's accurate, but because it exists. And existence in cultural terms is often more powerful than truth. Now pause here, because this is where things get uncomfortable for everyone involved. The phrase doesn't survive because it's factual. It survives because it taps into a broader discomfort with ambition, reinvention, and female agency when it appears too calculated. Hollywood loves ambition. It celebrates it. But only when it's cloaked in self-deprecation, when it pretends not to want what it clearly wants. Meghan has never pretended. She has been explicit about her goals, about her dissatisfaction, about her desire for more. That clarity, admirable to some, reads as threatening to others. And the phrase became a weaponized expression of that threat, not a literal claim, a symbol, a shorthand for the idea that her ascent wasn't organic but strategic, that her choices weren't romantic but transactional, that her narrative wasn't accidental but engineered. Again, those are perceptions, not proven facts. But perception is what Sundance responds to. And the moment that phrase entered the room, it signaled that these perceptions were no longer confined to the margins. They had crossed into the mainstream cultural conversation. That's why the reaction mattered more than the words. No one stood up to object. No one demanded an apology. No one reframed it publicly as misogyny in the moment. Instead, the room absorbed it. And absorption is how ideas spread. Now consider Meghan's position in that instant. For years, she's been fighting on two fronts: against hostile press, against institutional rigidity. Her strategy has relied on reframing herself as misunderstood, misrepresented, and mistreated. That strategy works when the audience accepts the premise. But the phrase challenged the premise itself. It didn't argue with her narrative. It questioned it. And questions are harder to rebut than accusations. You can deny an accusation, you can sue over it, you can condemn it. But how do you respond to a joke that exposes doubt? Laughing it off might suggest confidence. Confronting it might escalate. Ignoring it might look like avoidance. Every option carries risk. Meghan chose composure. That choice was understandable. It was professional, it was restrained, but restraint, in that context, allowed the room's interpretation to stand unchallenged. And Sundance audiences are ruthless in their interpretation. They don't need you to explain yourself. They don't want clarification. They want authenticity. And authenticity to them includes acknowledging uncomfortable perceptions. That's why the phrase lingered, because it named something no one else had dared to name in that space, not as truth, as tension. The aftermath revealed just how loaded it was. Over the next hours, conversations didn't center on whether the phrase was fair. They centered on why it resonated. That distinction is everything. People asked, why does this joke exist at all? Why does it persist? Why hasn't it been neutralized by years of advocacy, interviews, and projects? Those questions reopened doors that had been slowly closing, doors to old narratives, old skepticism, old fatigue. And once reopened, those doors let in more than anyone anticipated. The phrase became a lens through which people re-examined Meghan's entire public arc. Not just her marriage, not just her departure from royal life, but her post-royal trajectory, her partnerships, her branding, her storytelling choices. None of it changed overnight. But it was suddenly being viewed differently, and that's the quiet violence of a well-placed phrase. It doesn't destroy, it destabilizes. It introduces doubt where certainty once existed. Now, here's the irony no one wanted to acknowledge. By attempting to mock a stereotype, the moment inadvertently gave it renewed visibility, not because Amy endorsed it, but because Sundance allowed it to be spoken without immediate consequence. That created a ripple effect. Suddenly, critics felt emboldened. Supporters felt defensive. Neutral observers felt licensed to reconsider. And the conversation shifted from what Meghan was saying to what others were saying about her. That's a dangerous pivot for anyone whose power relies on narrative control. Because once you're no longer setting the terms of discussion, you're reacting. And reactions rarely play well at Sundance. What happened next didn't involve statements or press releases. It involved rewatching. Critics and insiders began revisiting past appearances, interviews, and projects with fresh eyes. Not to confirm the phrase, but to test it. Does the perception align with the pattern? Does the pattern suggest intention, or is this just projection? Those questions don't need answers to cause damage. They just need to circulate. And circulate they did. In hotel lobbies, in shuttle vans, in late-night dinners where careers are quietly shaped. The phrase became a reference point, a shorthand, not always spoken aloud, but present. And once shorthand enters the bloodstream of an industry, it's hard to flush out. The most unsettling part? Meghan never addressed it directly. Not that night. Not in the days that followed. Her team focused on the film, on the message, on positivity. That was likely the right call strategically. But silence, in this case, had a cost. Because silence allowed the phrase to float freely, unattached to rebuttal or reframing. And floating ideas are the hardest to contain. By the time the festival ended, the phrase had already evolved. It was no longer about the words themselves. It was about what Sundance had allowed to be said, and why. Which brings us to the part of the story that didn't happen under stage lights or camera flashes. It happened backstage, behind closed doors, where reputations aren't debated publicly, but decided quietly. And what was said there would shape everything that followed. He didn't flinch. That's what people noticed first. Not because flinching would have been dramatic, but because Prince Harry has never been good at hiding his reactions. When something lands wrong, it usually shows. A tightening around the eyes, a shift in posture, a half smile that never quite commits. This time, there was none of that. He stayed still. And in a room trained to read subtext, stillness screamed. Ask yourself this: when someone you love is the subject of an unexpected jab, what do you do instinctively? You laugh it off to diffuse the tension. You lean toward them, a subtle gesture of solidarity. You react. Harry did none of those things. He stared straight ahead, jaw set, shoulders squared, hands resting motionless in his lap. Not frozen in shock, but composed in a way that suggested something else entirely. Calculation. Because Harry understood something in that moment that many others didn't yet grasp. This wasn't about hurt feelings. It was about power shifting in real time. Harry grew up reading rooms like this. Palace rooms. Diplomatic rooms. Rooms where nothing is ever said outright, but everything is communicated through posture, silence, and timing. He was trained, from childhood, to notice when a room turns against you not with hostility, but with indifference. And that's what was happening. The laughter wasn't loud enough to be supportive. The silence wasn't strong enough to be condemnatory. The balance tilted into something far more dangerous. Assessment. Harry knew that look. He'd seen it before, in rooms where allies quietly withdrew, where smiles stayed polite, but invitations stopped coming, where the rules didn't change publicly, but outcomes did. So he didn't react, because reacting would have acknowledged the moment as emotional. And this wasn't emotional, it was structural. There's a common misconception about Prince Harry that he's impulsive, reactive, driven by feeling rather than strategy. That image has been reinforced over the years through interviews, memoir excerpts, and tabloid caricatures. But that night revealed a different side of him, a side shaped by institutional survival. Harry has spent his entire life inside systems that operate on optics rather than honesty. He knows when pushing back helps and when it accelerates damage. He knows when silence is safer than protest. And he knew instantly that defending Meghan in that moment would do more harm than good. Why? Because defense implies vulnerability. And vulnerability in that room was being tested, not rewarded. Had Harry laughed, it might have signaled confidence. Had he bristled, it might have escalated. Had he spoken up, it might have reframed the moment as conflict. But conflict would have given the room something to unite around. Instead, Harry offered nothing. No fuel. No spectacle. Just presence. And that presence was heavy. People noticed, not consciously perhaps, but the absence of reaction stood out precisely because it broke expectation. This was the man who had publicly defended Meghan countless times, who had framed their departure from royal life as a fight for dignity and safety, who had positioned himself as her shield. That shield didn't move, and that, more than the joke itself, unsettled the room, because it introduced a new question no one had anticipated. If Harry isn't reacting, what does he see that we don't? That question lingered far longer than the line itself. Harry's stillness wasn't passive. It was deliberate, the kind of stillness someone adopts when they realize they're no longer in control of the narrative and need to minimize damage. And that realization carried weight, because Harry isn't just Meghan's husband. He's her co-architect in the post-royal narrative. Their public strategy has always been presented as unified. Joint decisions, joint appearances, joint storytelling. But in that moment, unity wasn't performative. It was quiet. And quiet unity looks very different from public solidarity. Harry didn't reach for Meghan's hand. He didn't lean in. He didn't glance sideways to check her reaction. Those details mattered to people who watch body language for a living, because absence of reassurance can read as distance, not emotional distance. Strategic distance, the kind that says, we'll deal with this later. And later in Hollywood often means privately reassessing next moves. Now, to be fair, it's possible Harry simply chose not to react out of respect for the moment. Out of restraint, out of an understanding that making a scene would only amplify the issue. That's the generous interpretation. But Sundance rooms don't operate on generosity. They operate on inference. And the inference was this: Harry recognized the shift and opted to conserve energy rather than challenge it. That's not weakness, it's triage. Because when a room changes temperature, the smartest move isn't always to argue. Sometimes it's to observe, Harry observed. And the observation likely confirmed something he had already suspected, that their welcome was conditional. This wasn't the first time Harry had encountered cultural rejection. He'd felt it in Britain painfully and publicly. He'd experienced it through press hostility, institutional rigidity, and the suffocating weight of expectation. But this was different. This wasn't about monarchy or tradition. This was about credibility. And credibility, once questioned, is far harder to restore. Harry's face didn't betray anger. It didn't show hurt. If anything, it suggested resignation, not defeat. Acceptance. The acceptance of someone who realizes they're no longer the protagonist in the room. And that realization has consequences, because when you're no longer the protagonist, you're no longer driving the story, you're reacting to it. Harry knew that. Meghan, in contrast, was still performing presence, still projecting composure, still embodying the version of herself she has learned the world expects. But Harry had shifted into something else: containment. And containment signals that something is being managed behind the scenes. This is where the dynamic between them becomes critical. For years, Harry has been positioned as the emotional one, the reactive one, the wounded prince acting out of loyalty and love. Meghan, meanwhile, has been framed as the composed strategist, the poised communicator. That night, those roles inverted. Meghan maintained outward calm. Harry managed internal risk. And that inversion didn't go unnoticed. People in the room clocked it instinctively, not as marital tension, not as disagreement, but as divergence in approach. Harry was reading the room. Meghan was holding her line. Both responses made sense. Together, they told a story of two people navigating a moment neither had anticipated, in ways shaped by very different life experiences. Harry understands institutions. Meghan understands image. And Sundance challenged both, because institutions care about legitimacy. Images care about perception. And that night, legitimacy wavered. Harry likely felt it more acutely because he's lived through what happens when institutions withdraw support. He's seen how quickly doors close quietly, how narratives shift without announcement, how allies disappear without explanation. So he didn't react. He waited. That waiting posture continued through the rest of the event, through the applause, through the transition to the screening, through the Q&A that followed. He remained polite, attentive, present, but something in him had pulled back. And pulling back is often the first step in reassessment. This wasn't about embarrassment. It was about strategy, because once a moment like that occurs, you have to ask yourself difficult questions. Do we address it publicly? Do we ignore it and move on? Do we reinterpret it before others do? Harry's stillness suggested he was already weighing those options. And he knew something else too. Reacting emotionally would only confirm the room's suspicion that the moment had struck a nerve. By not reacting, he denied the audience that confirmation. But denial comes at a cost, because silence allows interpretation. And interpretation in a room full of storytellers is never neutral. As the event progressed, Harry remained a study in restraint. But restraint doesn't erase impact. If anything, it amplifies it, because people began projecting meaning onto his silence. Was he embarrassed? Was he angry? Was he resigned? The fact that no one could tell became part of the story. And ambiguity is rarely kind to public figures. By the time the night ended, the joke had already evolved into a symbol, not just of how Meghan was perceived, but of how Harry was adapting. No longer the outspoken defender, no longer the emotional lightning rod, but the observer, the man taking mental notes. That shift matters, because it suggests that even within the Sussexes' carefully curated partnership, something had been disrupted. Not trust, not loyalty. Certainty. Certainty about how the world would respond. Certainty about which spaces were safe. Certainty about how much control they still had. Harry's stillness signaled that certainty was gone. And once certainty disappears, the next phase begins. Re-evaluation. Not just by the audience, by the people at the center of the story. Because moments like this don't end when the lights go up. They follow you backstage. They follow you into conversations. They follow you into decisions. And as we'll see next, what happened after the camera stopped rolling proved far more consequential than anything that happened on stage. The applause came. It always does. That's the part people misunderstand when they imagine moments like this. They expect drama. They expect boos or outrage or a visible fracture. They expect a clean reaction that can be clipped, labeled, and explained. But Sundance doesn't work that way. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It wasn't hostile either. It was measured, polite. The kind of applause that fulfills an obligation rather than expresses enthusiasm. Hands came together, but eyes drifted. Smiles appeared, but they didn't quite reach faces. And in that subtle difference, everything changed. Because applause is currency in that room. It's how the audience signals acceptance, belonging, approval. And when applause becomes perfunctory, it means something else is happening beneath the surface. The room was cooling, not freezing. Not erupting, cooling. That's far worse. People shifted in their seats. Some leaned back, arms crossed loosely, not defensively, but thoughtfully. Others glanced at their phones, not to scroll, but to break eye contact with the stage. A few exchanged looks that said more than words ever could. This wasn't rejection. It was recalibration. Hollywood has 1,000 ways of saying no without ever uttering the word. Sundance specializes in the quiet ones. Because at Sundance, clapping isn't about politeness. It's about endorsement. And the endorsement had softened. You could feel it in the air, that barely perceptible shift that only happens when a room collectively decides to take a step back. Not away, just back enough to see more clearly. The energy that had carried the Sussexes into the venue as honored guests began to dissipate, not abruptly, gradually, like warmth leaking from a room when someone opens a door. And once that warmth escapes, it doesn't rush back in. People still smiled, still nodded, still behaved graciously. No one was rude, no one was confrontational. But the tone had changed. The questions that followed the screening were respectful but sharper, less congratulatory, more probing. Not aggressive, but curious in a way that carried weight. What inspired this? How did you approach authenticity? What did you hope audiences would take away? On the surface, these are standard festival questions. Underneath, they're tests. Sundance audiences don't ask questions to hear rehearsed answers. They ask them to see how you navigate discomfort, how you respond when the room isn't unequivocally on your side. Meghan answered with poise. She always does. Her responses were thoughtful, articulate, emotionally calibrated. She spoke about growth, intention, and storytelling with confidence. But something subtle had shifted. The room wasn't leaning forward anymore. It was listening, yes, but listening with distance. Distance is dangerous, because distance means the audience is no longer identifying with you. They're evaluating you. Harry spoke less. When he did, his answers were measured, careful, almost cautious. Gone was the raw emotional edge that had characterized so many of his public appearances in previous years. This wasn't the Harry of impassioned interviews or fiery declarations. This was a man choosing each word as if aware that the margin for error had narrowed. That awareness didn't go unnoticed. People clocked it, critics clocked it. Industry veterans clocked it, because when someone changes their cadence mid-event, it signals adaptation under pressure. And adaptation in a space that values spontaneity raises questions. Was this genuine? Was this rehearsed? Was this recalibrated in real time? The applause at the end of the Q&A mirrored the earlier response. Polite. Appreciative, reserved. And then something else happened. People stood, not all at once, but in clusters. Conversations didn't begin immediately. There was a lag, a moment where the room seemed to exhale, collectively releasing tension it hadn't acknowledged holding. That's when the real work began, because Sundance doesn't decide anything during the event itself. It decides in the aftermath, in the hallway conversations, in the shuttle rides back to hotels, in the late-night dinners where the same handful of names appear year after year. That's where the room truly speaks. And what the room said that night wasn't outrage, it was uncertainty. People didn't ask, was that appropriate? They asked, what does this mean? Meaning is the currency of Sundance, and meaning is where the Sussexes suddenly found themselves at a disadvantage. Because uncertainty invites interpretation, and interpretation invites narrative drift. As attendees filtered out into the cold Utah air, conversations hummed quietly, not excitedly, not angrily, thoughtfully, analytically. The kind of conversations that don't trend but matter far more in the long run. Did you notice the reaction? That line was, interesting. I didn't expect that. Do you think it landed the way she intended? No, one raised their voice.